Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to this auspicious event. This is the book launch of Karolina Krasuska's Soviet-born The Afterlives of Migration in Jewish American Fiction, published by Rutgers University Press in 2024. And I think we should start with a round of applause. Because it is not a small feat to publish a book. We are joined today to talk about your book by Izabela Kimak. Round of applause. And Ian Garner. And my name is Marta Usiekniewicz. So in a moment, we will kick this off. I just want to run down through what will happen in the upcoming 90 minutes, so everyone knows what's what. So in a few seconds, I'll introduce our panelists a bit more, and then we will move on, because we assume that some of you have not yet had a chance to read Karolina's book. So Karolina will do a short and sweet introduction and overview of how she spent the last couple of years and last years. And then I will invite Izabela and Ian to kind of comment on the book. We'll have a short conversation, and then between the four of us, and then we'll invite obviously questions from the audience, because this is why we are here. And then if we all behave very well, there is a reception at the end. Yes? Yes. Okay. So we should start from the star of today's event. Educated in Poland, Germany, and the United States, Karolina Krasuska is associate professor and the founder of Gender Sexuality Research Group. Her research and teaching areas include cultural theory, memory studies, gender studies, and 20th and 21st century literature, including Jewish American literature. Dynamic, student-centered, and socially engaged teaching constitutes the core of her pedagogy, and I can attest to that. I was the victim of her pedagogies as a student, and now as her peer at the ASC. She was awarded the University of Warsaw's Teaching Award in Humanities in 2017. Professor Karasuska initiated the American Studies Colloquium Series at the ASC in 2010 and is the founding director of Gender Sexuality Research Group, founded in 2016. Her research has been funded by multiple grants and awards and commented and lauded and celebrated all over the world. So good for you. Izabela Kimak is an assistant professor at the Department of British and American Studies at Maria Curie-Skłodowska University in Lublin, Poland. The shocking revelation that Lublin is in Poland, sorry. Her research interest encompasses contemporary American literature with particular emphasis on race, ethnicity, gender, and sexuality. She is the author of Bicultural Bodies, a study of South Asian American women's literature, published in 2013, and numerous scholarly articles, as well as co-editor of several volumes and special issues on contemporary American literature and culture. She is the Secretary General of the European Association for American Studies, as well as elected representative of the Polish Association for American Studies to the EAAS. A Kościuszko Foundation Fellow and a recipient of the Polish National Science Center Research Grant for the project Sweet Home Chicago, The Windy City, and the American Writers of Polish Descent. And I think that your project and Karolina's project kind of talk with one another in that terms. Finally, Ian Garner is an assistant professor at the Pilecki Institute. That is, I think, doing a rebrand given your research areas. I don't know. Maybe in the Q&A we can ask the more pressing questions about the Pilecki Institute. Who knows? He received his PhD from the Slavic department at the University of Toronto in 2017. He is the author of 2 books on Russian military culture and propaganda, Stalingrat Lives, Stories of Combat and Survival, and Z Generation, Into the Heart of Russia's Fascist Youth. Sorry. I think what transpires from our short conversation just before, like, this is not an interest in the army that is all about guns and tanks, but something, or war, that is something totally different. He remains an honorary fellow at the Center of International and Defense Policy in Kingston, Canada, and regularly comments and writes for major media outlets across the world. And my name, as I said, is Marta Usiekniewicz. I'm an assistant professor here at the ASC, and I think the reason why I'm doing this is mostly because we've talked about your book already several times, mostly in the podcast that I ran with Anna Kurowicka, Oswoić Gender. And so you assume that at least I have read the book enough to be able to do this.
I think the conversation was just amazing on these two podcasts. So, don't listen to them now, but listen to Marta's excellent humor and entertaining skills. Thank you so much. This is a very special evening for me, and I would like to read a little bit from the book as a start. But even before I do this, I think it's so special because I really think that this book grew out of the context of the American Studies Center here in Poland. I remember when I was teaching, looking for a new project after my PhD, and I was reading around and trying to teach new material. I remember teaching a book by David Bezmozgis, Natasha and Other Stories. And the way these stories set in Toronto and about Jewish Soviet immigrants resonated with my students then. This is back in 2013, I remember, when I first taught this. And the way their family memory back then, they were talking about their own stories of communism, their own still, living memories of the times. And thinking about Jewishness, we were also talking about ethnicity, we were talking about race, something that was much less present, and because Warsaw was a much less diverse city. So this is a book, and I say this in I think preface, that is very much linked to here and there, and this here is not here at Dobra, it's at Wierzbno, the other location, when this book was taking shape. So let me read. This is the beginning.
Do I need to hold you the mic for you?
Sure. This is the beginning of one of the chapters, the chapter Afterlives of Communism. And I would like to read this because a keyword that appears here in this introduction to this chapter appears now quite often in the political discourse during the election season. So try to see whether you can pick up this word. Okay. In November 2021, the US Senate witnessed bickering about a long-defunct Soviet organization known as the Komsomol. The Komsomol, a hallmark of the Soviet Union throughout the state's existence, was an abbreviation for the Russian Young Communist League, a helper organization of the Communist Party. The protagonist of the widely watched and commented upon hearing turned spectacle were Republican Senator John Kennedy and Soviet-born Ivy League professor Saule Omarova, Joe Biden's nominee for a key banking regulator. In his highly personal attacks, Kennedy tried to paint her youth in the Soviet Union as fundamentally disqualifying her from serving in the president's administration. For Kennedy, communist appeared to be an almost inborn trait. Once born and educated in the Soviet Union, one was and always remained communist. He famously quipped, "I don't know whether to call you professor or comrade." Omarova soberly protested his illogical speculation. Many criticized Kennedy for his Red Scare tactic, reminiscent of the anti-communists of the McCarthy era. Yet, in the end, his strategy worked, and Omarova withdrew her candidacy. This surprisingly recent scene contains all the elements of American stories in which individuals suffer scorn or ostracism merely because they were born and raised in the Soviet Union. Their essential and radical difference as a person and their incompatibility with US culture and politics, all of which is based on the straightforward identification as Soviet as communist. Typical gendered and racialized logic only amplifies this message, framing the stage along dominant hierarchies. A white cis man berates a woman of color, who Omarova was. Moreover, the dichotomy professor or comrade suggests the persistent ideal of the supposedly apolitical objective nature of research and academic instruction. And one more paragraph. Even though McCarthyism was eventually discredited and its anti-communist message has remained a staple of politics, whose participants and pundits rendered American communism as uncritical and irrational followers of the aggressively expansionist and anti-democratic Soviet Union. In this Cold War spirit, communist Jewish writers found themselves sidelined, and this genealogy of Jewish American writing is rarely foregrounded within literary histories. In a complementary move, Soviet-born individuals were assumed to be essentially communist. In his memoir, Little Failure, Gary Shteyngart, probably the best known of the cohort I focused on, reminisces how, quote, after one comment too many, end quote, while he was in school in the 1980s, he declared he was, quote, actually born in Berlin, end quote. The absurdity of the situation is not lost on the narrator, quote, so here I am trying to convince Jewish children in a Hebrew school that I am actually a German. Anti-Soviet and anti-communist sentiment in the US looms so large that in this rendering it has obfuscated the demons of World War II and the Holocaust. At that point, Shteyngart declares himself, quote, a 10-year-old Republican who, quote, loves America more than anyone loves America. His transformation towards progressivism starts in college, but first he became assimilated into wholesale anti-communism. Thank you. So this is an opening of one of the chapters, and I think it hits several notes that this book expands on in 5 chapters. I kind of ask myself, so what is it in the body of works? And there are a few dozens of writers who were Soviet-born and Jewish and who immigrated to the US from the 1970s till 1990s. And I ask myself, what in their literature, with the keyword migration, what differs in relation to Jewish American writing, American-born writing? And I think when we look at the cover, and here you have behind us the cover as well as the painting. The cover is a part of, this is a painting by Zoya Cherkassky-Nadi, a Soviet-born, Ukrainian-born artist, born in 1976. And this is a part of the series Soviet Childhood. And you may wonder, why this particular painting, and I think any of the paintings from the series could do, but I was really mesmerized by the flowers that are a huge part of the painting. It was clear when I was looking at the covers that red is a must. I think, especially Ian, when you work in Soviet history, one can not imagine basically a academic or non-academic book that would not have anything red on it. So I really like the idea that by choosing this for a cover, I can take control of the amount of red on the cover. But I also like the idea of having a lot of red, especially my own communist childhood. Red flowers were a staple, and we have them here today. I remember red carnations, red tulips, and red roses, and that's about it, depending on the occasion. But I also liked in these paintings of Soviet childhood the vividness that is here. When we very often think about how Eastern Europe is rendered in Jewish American literature, these are shtetls, desolate, post-Holocaust landscape of memory that is barren and the opposite of full of life. And with this cover, so the question for me was, how should we look at this? And how can we read this as Jewish? And exactly looking for markers that are not visible as stereotypical, what has become canonically Jewish in Jewish American literature, was what interested me. What I also liked in this painting was the diversity of persons depicted. You see different generations, you see older people, you see kids, and very often people who were immigrating as multi-generational families of various constellations. Also more and less traditional. I also like the idea of so many women being represented in this picture. And this may be a critique of K-work in the Soviet Union, like, the ideal of gender equality, but, you see kids basically still with women. And I also like the idea of the character in the red shirt, striped red shirt. Like, it's unclear to me how one would. It's unclear what gender of the person is. So there was a lot happening here, including this kind of everyday life, just going around their business. This is so different to the demonization of communist times that I introduced in the intro to this chapter I've just read. And I think a lot of the affinities, my affinities to the writing, are visible in this cover. Only after this cover arrived as cover design, I realized that I was living in a very similar building, white and green, for about 10 years of my life, including the kind of roundish structure. And in the conversations that I had with many of the writers for the book, these affinities were, I think, very important, especially that I was writing this book as a non-Jewish person, but raised in communist Poland. And here my knowledge of Russian also came as something useful, because I am the last class who had Russian as obligatory language. So now you know how old I am.
They might not.
No, you can just Google. All right.
Oh, that's it.
Yeah, I think that's it for now.
All right. Would you like to respond, Isa?
Yeah, of course. Thank you. I feel flattered for having been invited to this event, to your book launch, and thank you so much for having me. Thank you for this nice introduction. I should also add that I am an adjunct here, so I also have some connections to American Studies Center. Now, we were asked to keep this short and sweet, and I could easily spend way more than 5 minutes praising this book. I have pages of handwritten notes with me here. Now, but of course, I will be brief. Now, this book does deserve praise, and congratulations, Karolina. This is amazing scholarly work, and I will hit you with some maths, actually. So, starting from the end, 18 pages of works cited. And these are pages using very small font. So this gives you a sense of how thoroughly researched this book is. Now, Karolina analyzes here in detail, in those 5 chapters that you've mentioned, 11 novels, if I counted correctly, 2 short, including graphic novels, and 2 short stories by 11 writers, Soviet-born Jewish American writers, and making some references to several other texts as well. And she complements her analyses of these literary works with interviews with the majority of the writers. And now, the main argument, the way I understand it, is that her focus is on what these new voices contribute to, or how they challenge the established Jewish American literary canon, and how they push at the boundaries of the category of Jewishness or Jewish Americanness, if you will. Now, all of these writers that Karolina, whose work Karolina analyzes, are quite recent immigrants to the U.S., having moved there in the 1980s, give or take. And now the book is, the analyses are structured thematically. And even if you look at the list of concerns, of the thematic concerns of this fiction and Karolina's analysis, some of these may not strike you as necessarily new concerns for Jewish American literature, but even if these are old concerns, such as, for example, the post-memory of the Holocaust, they do offer new takes, as Chapter 2 demonstrates. Now, in these, apart from the memory of World War II and the Holocaust, those thematic preoccupations are cultural geography, gender and sexuality, migration, what am I missing? And communism. Yeah. There you go. Now, what I find most interesting is especially the focus on gender and race, and this is the subject matter of the last two chapters in this book, and these seem to me, I mean, the whole book is just well written and convincingly argued, but in those last two chapters, we are made to realize how these categories, such as gender, for example, can at times displace Jewishness, and you frequently touch upon how Jewishness is narrated by virtue of its absence, really, in this narrative, or lack of, absence is a better word, I guess. So in Chapter 4, Karolina discusses several narratives kind of speaking to the gender and intimacy orders of the Soviet Union, which are very interesting, and that also challenge this portrayal that you've mentioned of this kind of gender equality of the Soviet Union, and pointing to the basically the control of the citizens' bodies, and also the kind of the limitations of sex education in the Soviet Union. So perhaps we could talk more about that later on. And now, last but not least, what these voices bring is characters that do share this kind of migrant or refugee status, but are not necessarily Soviet-born. And this is the last chapter, focusing on keyword migration, and I find it very interesting, because those narratives, as you convincingly argue, they kind of counter the insularity of ethnic fiction, because they show certain affinities with representatives of other minority groups or races. Now, one final comment before I hand over the mic to you, Ian, is you mentioned, you talked a lot about the cover of your book, which is stunning, and what I find really appealing in your analysis is the discussion of book covers too. And actually, there are several book covers that we can actually see in Karolina's book, and the argument is that sometimes this deployment of very conventional imagery associated with communism and with the Soviet Union is at odds with the narrative itself. And your interviews with the writers also kind of touch upon that. And perhaps we could talk more about this orientalizing or reorientalizing character of the covers. And I'm very happy to find out that these narratives in themselves are not. They do not perform or perpetuate this kind of Orientalist image of Eastern Europe. But of course, the choice of the covers speaks more to the laws of the publishing market in the US and the preferences of the readers than to the writers themselves. Congratulations once again. Wonderful work.
Perfect. Well, firstly, thank you for having me, and thank you for letting me read the book, which really is quite good. I wouldn't have come here. I think it was good. I would have found an excuse not to come. And I mean, you've already described what a lot of work has gone into this book, and yet it comes out with, what, 180 pages? So there is a lot condensed into here, which actually is really hard. It's harder to write a short book like this than one of those 600-page marathons that never seems to end. But I want to as well compliment the style of the writing in it, because this is well written. And now, all due respect, some gendercide cultural studies books are quite hard to read. This is very, I know, I'm sorry. This is very complicated, but beautiful to read. It's really well written, and you know, even some of you I can see are probably undergraduates. You'll be able to pick up this book and get a lot out of it without feeling like you're kind of, you know, drowning in theory and complexity and need to go read this and that and the next footnote and the next footnote. So you'll love it. And good job, Professor Krasuska, for doing that, because it's not easy. Before I move into my main comments, I want to comment on the cover as well. And I don't know, in Poland, do you have the association of poppies with war memory? Like red poppies?
No, this is I think it's a Western European trope. No.
Because as somebody who is British Canadian, when I look at that cover, and I know it's supposed to be tulips, I see a field of red poppies, and that screams to me war. And so I go into this book thinking about war. I mean, I'm always thinking about war. It's my job. And this book is riven through with references to war and destruction and fragmentation of the self and fragmentation of identity that arise from war. And it's interesting that the passage that you chose to read, Hell, was the beginning of the Afterlives of Communism chapter, because that, I thought, for me as a scholar and as a reader, was the most striking chapter, because that's really where you seem to get to grips with what it means to reconstitute the self in a time and in a place where you are told that you cannot have any agency in reconstituting yourself, where you are either this or that, you are either professor or tovarищ. I'm guessing Kennedy didn't say tovarищ, did he?
No, just comrade. Yeah.
No, he must have said comrade.
Yeah.
It's the brain one. He didn't know the word. And Karolina unpacks that, delves into some detail and talks about it. I'm sure you'd like to talk about it some more, but I want to point out how relevant this discussion of what it meant to be Soviet and coming to the West is today. Because right now we're seeing a huge wave of Russian speakers, of people who are coming out of that, let's call it the post-Soviet space, just for shortness' sake, and trying to figure out what it is to be themselves, what it is to be in a new environment, where in the West frequently they're told that they are genetically inherently Russian, including Ukrainians who are told that they are somehow Russians, they have identities foisted on themselves. And where the Russian state, on the other hand, is telling them, you absolutely have no agency in the way that you reconstitute your identity. You cannot be a Russian unless you are straight, unless you are a man, unless you subscribe to extremely traditional gender roles, and ultimately, unless you see militarism and the assault on other people and the fragmentation of other people's cultural identities as an important part of your being and what it means to be a Russian. So that is all being taken away again. And so I wonder, as we're talking, Karolina, if maybe you might, I know you probably haven't researched this, just speculate about where you think things might go for today's migrants, in particular because I want to throw in a curveball, something else has changed today. And that is the nature of communication between the homeland and between the migrant abroad, where you can live a virtual reality. We're seeing borders collapse, time and place are collapsing. The Russian state is able to create communities of so-called subscribers of traditional values around the world. And this complicates things in all sorts of ways. And so I'm going to toss that to you, and you can think through it and be interested to know what you have to say.
Okay, so as you toss it in your head, I was thinking, from the had a few thoughts. I was listening to your responses to your take, and then to your responses to Karolina's book, and kind of what stuck with me is you talk about this continuity, how migration due to war or other reasons creates this kind of points of discontinuity. And I think this is something that you, Karolina, theorize in your book, kind of like there's this purportedly same point of departure for those who stay and those who go. And then this begins a new kind of line of memory making, of history making, of cultural production that kind of maybe stems from the same point of reference, but is played out in a different way, be it like at the location and in this new location. And then you, Isa, talked about the kind of orientalizing gesture that happens to the back home, right? Whatever that back home is, and the kind of projection onto this old country that can be then, represented almost graphically, right? As in those book covers. And now I was thinking that in terms of specifically Jewish imageries of Eastern Europe, right now we're about to see 2 films come to Polish screens that kind of, I don't know, I haven't seen them, but I've seen the trailers and I'm suspicious, that address kind of the American Jewish vision of specifically Poland. One is A Real Pain, the film with Kieran Culkin and Jesse Eisenberg, that is kind of set in contemporary Poland. And then there is another one with Lena Dunham and Stephen Fry called Treasure, and speaking of Zamachowski, I should say, that is set, I think, either in late 80s or early 90s Poland. And like, at least based on how these films are being sold to us, they're really repeating a certain shorthand of Poland being the landscape for an American Jew to kind of, or a British Jew, to find themselves, to discover something about their past. And this kind of back and forth is definitely something very present in the books you are analyzing and examining in Soviet porn. So given that, I wanted, first of all, to let you answer Ian's kind of hypothesizing about the future, but I am interested to hear you talk more about this kind of back and forthness and this kind of I don't know, those points of reference that are seemingly the same, but because of that discontinuity turn out to be something else entirely. Like they're like the same geographical place or the same date, but it is one that has different significance for a community, quote unquote, back home, and a community in this new place. And I think you're right, Ian, that this is very much troubled by the fact that with contemporary immediacy of media, this back home new place is like troubled in some way. So, this like small question for you.
First, I think something about a real pain.
Have you seen it?
I haven't seen it. I think it's it's coming
soon.
To the Jewish Film Festival, right? In early November. But one thing that is clear for me from the trailers, these 2 guys are in love with Polish trains, and when you compare them to Amtrak, they, one really should. So, there may be orientalizing traits in this movie, but come on. These trains,
a love letter
trailers,
to PKP.
I think so. Yes, maybe like let's be more modest, intercity. So this is just a quick comment about this. But the question of war is very interesting, and you seeing the poppies on the cover. In fact, when I think about basically all the chapters, like you can see the traces and the war. Of course, I mean, this is the Great Patriotic War. This is how World War II was known. Was known in the Soviet Union, is known as Russia. But another thing about the war, and this is part of the rewriting of chapter 2, when you think about the community of Soviet Jews in New York, in Brooklyn, the thing that they were celebrating till before the pandemic was the Victory Day, and the parade was on the 9th of May. So you could see highly decorated citizens parading, and these were Jewish soldiers of the Red Army. So thinking about the connotations of Sovietness and Jewishness in the U.S., the war and active combat is such an important trait of memory. And the way it intersects with the post-memory and memory of the Holocaust is very interesting, and this is one of the kind of the same and different. The connotations are just very different because the lived experience matter. Someone told me a few days ago, people in Cambridge, this posh professor sit and you need to just have one smart sentence in 3 years. So I think I have this quip thing in this book. It's a different Holocaust that is remembered, and it's remembered differently. I think it's been already even cited. But so I think this is the sentence of the book, but I think it really permeates the book, the memory of the war. If you think about the intimacy chapter, if you think about the comparative ethnic chapter, you see at least traces of that. Maybe I can also comment really briefly about post-2022. The chapter, I think I also wanted to read the introduction to chapter 3, Soviet Afterlives, I believe, because this is a chapter that was not planned. It happened. When I had an outline of the book, and when the full-scale invasion on Ukraine broke out, it was clear that I had a chapter to write on Russian authority, Russia under Putin and Soviet-born immigrants. But the way I changed the focus, I changed the novels I'm considering. And I was painfully writing it, really feeling how the reality caught up to my research in a tragic way. So this, I think this is why I wanted to read this one, and again, it's an important chapter for me.
May for a moment?
Yes.
Oh, thank you. Sorry. Okay. I'm thinking that this was a very non-pedagogical moment where you say that you had an outline and then you changed something in it. So students writing papers, please ignore that part of everything that Karolina has said, and then let's move on. I would be interested maybe to ask you, Isa, to comment a bit, because you focus in your research or recent research on another kind of group who migrated. Let's say, is it another group or is it the same group? Is it part of the same group? This is something maybe you can address. But I'm wondering, having read Karolina's book, how does it map on the other kind of migrant writers, or maybe specifically Polish migration and the cultural output that you see being generated, in comparison, in continuity of Karolina's work?
Sure. Actually, when I was reading this book, my thinking went kind of in a twofold manner, because I was also going back to my much earlier research about or into South Asian American writing, and I was seeing, and I don't want to talk about my own research today. Really, it's not today is not about me. But I was thinking about the kind of the overlaps between those different bodies of texts, and how individual authors would sometimes make very, very similar decisions. And this ties into what you asked earlier about those points of departure and points of arrival, and of course, regardless of the context in which the specific cultural context of individual writers, these points of departure and arrival would be different, but some tendencies in essentializing, for example, the point of departure would work across across writing coming from various minority groups. This is one thing. When it comes to Polish American writing, what is interesting is that it tends to be quite silent on Jewishness. But it
shock and disbelief. I mean,
but of course it harks back to the whole kind of discussion and definition of Polishness and what it means to be a Polish American. And it's not to say that I really don't want to say that immigrants from Polish lands and the majority of the Polish diaspora in the U.S. kind of dates back to this biggest wave of migration at the turn of the 20th century. So I don't want to say that they were a homogeneous group, because they weren't, but a certain rhetoric kind of prevailed, and that rhetoric posited Roman Catholicism as a quintessential element of Polishness. So, another thing is that because of course those communities in which Poles settled, they were not homogeneous at all, and they lived side by side with other groups, including Jews. But the writing is it's really silent about that to a large extent.
I was kind of a side comment I have in terms of funding for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has a fund for projects that address kind of like Polonia, right? So Polish people living outside of Poland. And a cool thing is that it's mostly thought of in the same way as this rhetoric you just mentioned, that is predominantly a Roman Catholic immigration of also particular maybe social class background and so forth. But I wanted to say that within the nonprofit that I work for, we had a program that was funded from the very same money that posited that Jews from Poland, or the descendants of Jews from Poland, also can count as Polonia, and kind of, and we got ministry's money. Obviously, this was prior to not the last elections, but the ones even earlier. But it kind of talks about this kind of critical openness to a criticism of who counts as like the Polish immigrant to the United States, and that it can be appended even in the like structures of a system such as the Ministry of Foreign Affairs kind of represents for me in this anecdote. I'm talking about structures and foreign affairs, Ian. I know you represent an institute, right? So a structure, maybe not foreign affairs. But I wanted to ask you more about a lot of your research is about kind of challenging this like normative subject, the white cis hetero invested in the military ideologies. And I'm wondering that as you were reading Karolina's take on kind of the gender analysis of this kind of migration, I was wondering like how did it resonate with the research that you're doing on maybe less fiction, but let's say history, right? Or this kind of experiences of actual humans.
Okay, let me run by you the project that I'm working on right now, which kind of doesn't even make sense to me right now.
Oh, brilliant.
So, good luck. It's about killing. Why people on the margins in Russia seem to be drawn into the Russian army and seem to have been drawn into the Russian army over the last century and ended up committing some of the worst atrocities of the Russian army. And so it's about the crossing of boundaries, right? The movement from the outside to the inside of what I conceive of as an imperial center. And I'm looking at the experiences of these people and trying to reconstruct what their inner lives were like, what their subjective lives were like. And so it crosses from non-fiction, it crosses from diaries and memoirs into fiction and drama and film. And as I was reading this book, I was just really struck by how, by the end of the book, I felt really uncertain about things. Oh. Right? But I mean that in a very positive way. Because we do tend to essentialize when we think about these kind of categories. In particular, Jewish American fiction, I have a very clear idea of what that is, right? I'm thinking Woody Allen. Right? And
problematic figure if
yeah,
ever
exactly.
there was one, but
let's
sure.
Let's not talk about Woody Allen anymore. You know what I mean? That's the culture, right? But you just find ways to show how these authors at times indulge in this kind of fragmentation and destruction and disorder and do it deliberately, but at times are quite playful. Like this little business of Shteyngart dressing up, and was it Shteyngart for the photo with the
bear?
He's holding the bear and he's got the leather jacket on, and this is Shteyngart, the famous author, and he had was it on one of his books?
Yes, it was the first book. Yeah.
There you are. So a picture where he's kind of playing with the idea of him being a stereotyped Russian, and he's sort of deliberately disempowering himself. But then I'm also thinking, well, he has the power to do that because he has a book. He has this great framing device where he can take power, but many of the people that I'm looking at don't feel like they have that power. And for them, to get back to the real miserable shit that I'm looking at most of the time, for them killing is the means. Killing is the mechanism by which they transcend the border from the outside to the inside. But for these people, they have different powers to do it. Sorry, that was a bit of a ramble, because like I said, I don't really understand my own book yet.
It's sure. Would you like to maybe respond to?
Yeah, I'm happy to respond with my ramble to your ramble. I mean,
scholarship at its best.
Yes, of course. One of the things that you're talking about margins and center. One of the things that interested me here is when we think about Jonathan Safran's Four, everything is illuminated and things like that. The idea of Eastern Europe is also very much defined geographically. What is going on in this fiction, that we get also insight to larger Soviet Union, and we get insight to, we go to Siberia with these authors, we go to Caucasus, we go to big cities. There's a lot of Moscow in here. There are many locations, and also what this means to be a post-Soviet or Soviet-born Jew also gets fragmented in a way. There are many options. There are many locations. These locations differ for also reasons. Other ethnic minorities in the USSR. The story Anya Ulinich Petropolis, that in fact I know was it was taught before me here at the center. This is an amazing satirical novel in which there is a nominally Jewish Afro-Russian character. So this is this spoof on American identity politics, because this Sasha, the protagonist, lands in Arizona and she's misread in all possible ways. But very often she's not marked as Jewish. So there's a lot of diversity that these authors offer, and they are really trying to question what we tend to think, and what we understand under categories, sometimes very set categories. I can also very quickly comment on the media, because I think I skipped this in the previous round. Yes, absolutely. Early 20th century, it feels like once you leave the old world, you're never coming back, and there is this division. But that even before World War II, we have footage of people coming back to Eastern Europe, and people who made it. And the interesting thing about this, and again, media, we have footage. Like they come to Eastern Europe and they make films, like they make home videos. So I don't have time for 20 more projects, but if I had, this would be one of the things that I find immensely interesting, also because it counters our idea of what is going on. But in this fiction, even in Ulinich, there are phones and there is TV. In one of the recent books by Maria Kuznetsova, there are her conversations with her grandmother who did not immigrate in the Soviet Union. I think at that point this was via Skype. Now it would be something else probably. So there are these ideas of exchange and definitely connection.
As you were talking about this footage, there's a wonderful book and then a documentary film called 3 Minutes in Poland, a Lengthening, where a home video recorded in 1939 by people who were immigrants from Poland into the United States came back in 1939 for like a tour of Europe and managed to catch 3 minutes of pre-war shtetl Poland that then became this kind of footage of a community that's no longer there, and including this is shot in Nasielsk near Warsaw. So it's kind of like when we talk about where the fact that the history of pre-war Nasielsk is preserved on a home video in an American attic, and like that this visual, this archive is coming back, let's say, to Poland or to the world from that direction, even though it should have been transmitted, I don't know if should, but if history was different, it could have been transmitted in a more linear way without this discontinuity. Before I move on to giving a chance to our audience to maybe ask questions or share comments, I wanted to ask about something that is, for me, especially very interesting in the novels you analyze and in the discussion of this. I think this is to do with migration and migrant literatures, and that is language and untranslatability, but also the fact that these books, even if they are written in English later on, are translated back, right, or into other languages, creating even more challenges of and it's just, so it's on the level of language, but also of concepts, of those points of reference. So like if you could maybe talk a bit about how you approach it in your analysis, and then if time allows, I would probably ask you, Isa, to also comment a bit about that from your perspective.
I mean, this is very interesting, because if you think about this, this is a cohort of writers who came into the U.S. either as kids or as teenagers, young adults. So some of them immigrated when they were 6 or 7, and it's interesting how when you have recordings or when you have them in a room together, you can, some of them don't have an accent. Some of them have pretty, they sound East European. And you can read this, from basically when they're immigrated. So for some of them, there was no question what language to write in. But with some of them, writing in English was even a way to learn the new language. And this is an example of Lara Vapnyar, who came to the US in her 20s. And she was first just writing. And writing was a way to educate herself to speak English, to be able to function in this language. So the idea of what happens or what avenues are taken, all of them are pretty much they're Russian speaking. But the avenues that are taken to arrive at a book in English are multiple. This is also not a unitary situation. There is one poet who does write in Russian, and it's interesting that this may be a difference of the genre. Polina Barskova immigrated in her 20s, was already a published writer in Russian, and she's been living for decades now in the US, but she continues to write in Russian, and her work is translated into English. So here you have a curveball, right? Like, and this is pretty much an exception among this cohort. So maybe not translating experience, but back to language and the materiality.
Actually, I would like to respond with a question to you, Karolina, because when I was reading your analysis, I was also wondering if there are any fragments in Russian in those texts, because this is a tendency that I noticed in many migrant narratives, that the authors would include at least snippets of their native languages or their ancestors' languages as a deliberate choice, and without offering any translation for the mainstream reader, which is also perhaps a way to signal the difficulties that the migrants themselves have, like when it comes to language and acquiring a new language. So here, American mainstream readers are kind of put in a similar situation of having to, like, being exposed to a text that resists their reading in a way. So I would be very curious to find out more about that.
I mean, this is the curious thing, that there is very little of Russian actually in this literature. There would be, what you usually get are individual words that then are clear from context. There are no passages. So this is if we kind of enter translatese, which I don't use in the no jargon in the book. It's kind of domesticated. Like so much is it's written to be pretty easily consumed by the American audience, which is also an interesting strategy. And I think this may also be in line with what kind of text I'm considering. So I don't talk about self-published texts in this book, and there is a whole array of self-published texts that may then have other strategies. I'm talking about literature that was published by mainstream presses. So the question of literary market, and then also marketing, and then also the covers becomes important. So how is it sold? How is it presented for general consumption? And here, editing is also important. One of the books I'm writing about, Replacement Life by Boris Fishman. This is a very funny novel, and I know that Boris is. This is a very funny novel about a scam that survivors, World War II survivors or Holocaust survivors, were running. And in fact, it did happen in the U.S. Certain categories of survivors were not eligible to apply for monies, for compensation from the German government, and they were faking their testimonies to fit into the category. Talking about categories. So this is what the book is about. First, when he had an idea of faking claims, he had an idea to have a book about two situations, the one from World War II and the other from Katrina. He was heavily discouraged by his editor to include the part on Katrina. And this is, I had this in my interviews, with the kind of clear suggestion, it will just not sell. So kind of staying within clear identity categories was very important for the book market. And I think this also answers part of the question why you have relatively little foreignness you do have, or how foreignness is being translated. But on the other hand, you do have, you don't only have bleak Eastern Europe. So there is something happening, but I don't believe this is on the linguistic level.